That leads us into our class this week. We have 2 more classes in Joshua. And so, talking to some of the other teachers during the prep class, they were not so thrilled that we weren't just get to chapter 24 already. Well, we have to get to chapter 23 first. And then they're like, but chapter 23 is just setting up chapter 24. Let's go. I'm like, I get it. But also, we need to slow down, take our time here. And so, before we really jump in, since we are winding down the quarter, we've covered several good topics to talk about. We talked about faith, obedience, trust, our relationships. And I'm not going to list them all because what were some of those themes, those points that you guys took away from our lessons that you found impactful? Or if nothing, I'll just leave now and you guys can figure out what else to do with class. So, I wasn't expecting you guys to actually not have anything.
Refresh my memory, what did we study last week?
We studied last week the allocation of the lands. But then before that we were in Ruth. And in chapter 4 we talked about the marriage between Boaz and Ruth. Before that we talked about the relationship between Boaz and Ruth. And then we got into, back in chapter 2, the week before that, we talked about Ruth being a foreigner in her land and being taught by Naomi kind of what she was supposed to do, and how Boaz was a man of, I guess, a godly nature, so much so that his actions went before him. And we were able to see he is kind of that example of what we are being called to be when Jesus says, take care of the least of these. Take care of the foreigner, the widow, the poor, the hungry. Well, that's exactly what Boaz was doing to Ruth. And then the week before that, we were talking about the relationship between Naomi and Ruth, as Ruth is uprooting her entire life, and we're going to go, and I'm going to go live with my mother-in-law in a foreign land, and we're going to be poor together, but we'll be together. And so what does that mean? And then the week before that, we were back in Joshua for the first time, and we were going through the Gibeonites, no, not the Gibeonites, the destruction of the kings who had gone up against the Gibeonites. And the week before that was the Gibeonites and the holding the sun in the sky. And the week before that was the conquest of Ai. And the week before that was Jericho. And the week before that was crossing the Jordan. And the week before that was when Jim taught. And then the week before that was Galatians. And so anything in there stand out to any of y'all?
We see God's providence in all of it.
Yes.
I mean, things that don't seem very likely, or maybe not even possible, but He is providing for those people.
Yes.
And He still is today.
We can see it in our personal lives.
Sure.
Continued faithfulness.
Continued faithfulness.
Joshua was true to the Lord. He was obedient. I don't remember an instance where he really messed up. He was obedient to God and he followed God like Moses did.
Sure.
And I appreciate that.
Well, it's a good thing that you brought up Moses, because this week is kind of Joshua's version of what Moses told him at the end of Moses' life. Joshua has become old. He's well past not being a fighting man anymore. He is now almost dead, is kind of the expectation. He is going off, I'm going to retire, and it's not going to be very long after that I'm going to die, and my family is going to have to plan the funeral. It's not my worries. That's their job. But it's one of those moments in which you get the whole issue of well, what are we supposed to tell the next generation? And we've kind of brought it up, and we talked about it a little bit of the altars or the memorials or the monuments that would be built up throughout the whole story of Joshua. Well, why do we have this pile of stones over here? Well, it's so that this place was important because that's where Jericho was destroyed, or that's where we crossed the Jordan, or that's a sign of we were the eastern tribes and we fought to ensure that the west would have their land and they would see the promises of God fulfilled. Well, here again, the tribes of Israel, or at least the leaders and the elders and all of the different, I guess, titles you could possibly be, the judges, the clansmen, we can list all the possible names that they could have called their leaders, but the idea is in chapter 23, Joshua is rallying together the leaders to give them, here is the final instructions. If you remember nothing else about my time as a leader, if you remember nothing else about what I'm doing, here are my instructions for you. And so let's go ahead and jump in to chapter 23. And it's only one section, so I'm only going to read it in the whole entirety. So if I lose my breath, be patient. Starting in verse 1. A long time afterward, when the Lord had given rest to Israel from all of their surrounding enemies, and Joshua was old and well advanced in years, Joshua summoned all of Israel, its elders, its heads, its judges, its officers, and said to them, I am now old and advanced in years, and you have seen all that the Lord your God has done to all these nations. For your sake, for it is the Lord your God who has fought for you. Behold, I have allotted to you the inheritance for your tribes, those nations that remained, along with all the nations that I have already cut off, from the Jordan to the great sea in the west. The Lord your God will push them back before you and drive them out of your sight. And they shall possess the land as the Lord your God promised to you. Therefore, be strong and keep to what is written in the book of the law of Moses, turning aside from it neither to the right nor to the left, that you may not mix with these nations remaining among you, or make mention of their names, of their gods, or swear by them, or serve them, or bow down to them. But you shall cling to the Lord your God, just as you have done to this day. For the Lord has driven out before you great and strong nations. And as for you, no man has been able to stand before you to this day. One man of you puts flight to thousands, since it is the Lord your God who fights for you, just as he promised. Be careful, therefore, to love the Lord your God. For if you turn back and cling to the remnant of these nations, remaining among you and making marriages with them, so that you associate with them and they with you, know for certain that the Lord your God will no longer drive out these nations before you. But they shall be a snare and trap for you, a whip on your sides and thorns in your eyes, until you perish from off this good ground that the Lord your God has given you. And now I am about to go the way of all the earth. And you know in your hearts and souls, all of you, that not one word has failed of all the good things that the Lord your God promised concerning you. All have come to pass for you. Not one of them has failed. But just as all the good things that the Lord your God has promised concerning you have been fulfilled for you, so the Lord will bring upon you all the evil things until he has destroyed you from off this good land that the Lord your God has given you, if you transgress the covenant of the Lord your God, which he has commanded you, and go and serve other gods and bow down before them. Then the anger of the Lord will be kindled against you, and you shall perish quickly from off the good land that has been given to you. And that's chapter 23. And you see, okay, but where's the and but? Well, sure, the and but is coming. It's chapter 24, but that's next week. We'll talk about it then. This there's several things that I think we need to talk on, and if not, at least I'll be talking at you about it. You don't necessarily have to talk back to me about it if you don't want to. But one of those main characteristics, themes, points that I think needs to be drawn out here is this idea of leadership. We just went through our study back in December of shepherding, and then we did the whole shepherd process, and then eventually we got new shepherds. But part of it is not, of church leadership is not just who our shepherds are, who our deacons are, who our ministers are. There are leaders who aren't named as leaders, and probably for good reason, because if they had the title, they'd be too powerful, and who could stop them, right? But it's one of those, leadership looks different, and yet Joshua doesn't just call together the elders of Israel. He's not just calling together the judges. He calls all the leaders that are recognized in some capacity together, and he's teaching them a lesson about how to lead Israel. Israel has been, up to this point, as it's become a nation led by one guy. Well, for a long time, that was Moses. We're being led by Moses. Moses is going to take us to the promised land. He gets us there, and then we say, no way, that is too scary, that's too big of a job, I'm going to leave. And Moses is still the leader when they're like, all right, so we're going to wander in the desert. And for 40 years, until that older generation who did not do what God had asked them to do is all dead because they're wandering in the desert, then we'll be able to go back. But Moses messes up himself, and then Moses is told, sorry, Moses, you're not going to be able to enter the promised land either. Then what we end up getting is Moses is told to appoint Joshua. Go and appoint Joshua as the next leader of Israel. All right. So Deuteronomy ends with Joshua being charged by Moses, be strong and courageous. Do not waver from the law to the left or to the right. Do what is good in the eyes of the Lord. And what does Joshua now tell these individuals here and now? Be strong and courageous. Do not waver from the law of the Lord to the left or to the right. Do what is good in the eyes of the Lord. It's interesting how much of leading falls under the idea of following. Yeah, I'm going to go there. So when we talk about shepherding, right, we I don't know what Gary covered in here, but the idea is that when we appoint shepherds, they're shepherding, but they're also being shepherded by someone else. And even in the New Testament, we can jump to the points of where Paul says the shepherds, the elders, they are to be following the shepherd, the elder, the head of the body, which is Christ. Well, here's the same idea. Leaders of the church, you need to follow not necessarily my example or Moses' example. Follow what God has put before you. God is giving you instructions. God is giving you guidance. Follow it. God is giving you the route of what to take. Don't go off onto some other side road. Take the road God is telling you to take, so that you may lead the people, those who are already following you. You need to not lead these people astray. So if God is leading you one way, it's because he wants all of the people, not just you, all of the people that are following you to follow that path as well. But, of course, they fail at it. Especially, well, they all fail at it. Because it's not long after that in Judges 1, we get the whole story of, and then Joshua died, and then we get the list of, and then all the elders and the leaders of Israel did kind of what they thought was right. what you think is right is not what God says is right. So you are already starting to, okay, maybe we can skirt this rule. Or God didn't really mean that when he said that in the law. And we could avoid this part, or we don't have to do that. Which sometimes we do the same thing today of, well, did God really mean this? What, was that God speaking through Paul, or did Paul just say that because that's what Paul thought? Well, why do we need to listen to James and when he says this about watching our tongue? Surely James doesn't understand what that's about. I'm gonna say and think and do whatever I think is right, and I'm just gonna tell it as it is because that is the best way I can lead and be impactful in the church, is just tell them how they're all wrong, all the sins they're doing. I'm just gonna rattle off the list every week. Yeah, that's gonna go over really great. I'm sure you're gonna be super popular. Everyone loves being told everything about what they're doing is wrong all the time, especially if you're not even the one leading. You're just some guy who's talking and saying bad things about everyone behind their back. And those same things happening here. Joshua is trying and pleading with the leaders of Israel. You don't have to follow my example in the fact of, well, what would Joshua have done in this example? I'm not asking you to think about what would Joshua would do in this example. I'm not asking you to think of what Moses would do in this example. I'm telling you, do what God is telling you to do in this example. Do you not remember the battles we were in? And how when we didn't do what God told us to do, it went poorly for us? When we thought we knew better? I'm asking you, pleading with you, leaders of Israel, do not do that when you're leading the people of Israel. Because Joshua had to learn the hard way, right? What we see even in those first couple chapters, he's not a perfect leader. He's not coming out and batting 1,000. No, he messes up sometimes. He has some pitfalls. Some places that he's not super strong in the leadership aspect of. Surely, going back to Jericho, surely he's not handling all those grumblers very well, right? Because if he was handling them well, they're probably not being recorded in Joshua as being grumblers, right? If he's a strong leader in that moment, and he is the perfect leader, surely no one's sitting there and thinking, what does this guy know? Who is he? But also, we do have an example of a perfect leader. And the people still grumbled about him. His name is Jesus. He comes in the New Testament. He's in those first 4 books, and all the books after him are about him, and everything before it is about him. And it's everything in our Bibles is about this one leader who's perfect, who's not like Joshua, who has the pitfalls, and he's not like David, who's he was a great king and great warrior, but his personal life was a mess. He's not like Solomon, who had all the wisdom, but his personal life was a mess. And yet he comes into the world, and it's not exactly how people thought it would be, and people grumble. But of course, Joshua is coming in. He's receiving the grumbling, and he's telling the elders now of there's going to be hard times in leadership. There's going to be a hard time as these guys. Moses told me how bad they were. Let me tell you about it. It was so much worse than Moses was making it out to be. What was Moses downplaying this for? Yeah, sorry. But it's one of those, of course they don't listen. They're quick to, well, I'm leader, I'm in charge, I have some power, so I'm going to use it to do what I want. And then by the time of the judges, it is so bad that God has to call upon individuals to either become a judge, or he has to call on judges who aren't doing their job and tell them, do your job. It's not that hard. Just do it. I've given you the instructions. Well, Joshua also has reminded them, and they're still not doing it either. So this chapter can kind of shade us into these questions of, well, what makes a good leader? Well, they're following God. Well, what does that mean for an election year? None of those guys seem to follow God. That's a great question. I don't know.
They pretend they do.
They pretend they do. They claim to have gone to a church service once and that they know how to read their Bibles, but then they'll say something like 2 Corinthians, and you get the whole, no, that's not how it's pronounced. That's not what it is. Or they mispronounce a name that, like Solomon, and you're like, no, that's not his name. It's not Solomon. It's Solomon. Have you read your Bible recently? Clearly not. Have you been to church recently? Clearly not. And yet, they'll say, no, I'm a devout Christian. I stand for Christian values. Do you? Are you being strong and courageous and doing what God has commanded you to do? Probably not. You can maybe make an argument for some, but even then, that's a very small few. An election year almost like this one, let's see, there's almost 500 representatives that will be elected this year to the U.S. Congress. There will probably be another 18 senators. We have a presidential election. It's coming up. There's going to be probably 20 governors up for election, and a few of that number. So we're almost at 600 to 700 people who are being voted in on the national level as leaders. Not even talking about school boards or city council or mayor, because we still don't have one of those here. And let's run down the list. Comptroller, ag commissioner, railroad commissioner, let's run down the list. And it gets to thousands and thousands of individuals. And they're supposed to be leaders. Often we ask them to be godly leaders. Especially when they start off in the small towns, and they're in our churches still. We're asking them to be godly, but are they keeping the law of the Lord? How long before they throw that out the window? It's not a condemnation on them. It's what happens to Joshua. Joshua says, I am asking you, I'm pleading with you, I'm putting you in charge of these people. I'm asking you to be godly leaders. Do we not do the same thing? I'm asking you, as the mayor of Lubbock, I want you to be a godly leader. But there will come a time where power is going to corrupt even the best individuals. Well, we saw it with David. King David seems like he's batting 1,000. He breaks out onto the scene. He has a great rookie season. He defeats a giant in front of Saul. He's then persecuted for that because Saul was like, well, I'm not going to let some kid steal all my thunder. Right? And so there's the whole back and forth, and then eventually David becomes king. He starts off for those first couple years are pretty good. But by the end of his reign, he has messed up so many times that they've put his mistakes in 2 different books of the Bible, and then it causes them to think, hey, maybe we should record his lines mistakes as well. Because they're going to make mistakes, and it's going to be important, and it's going to come back to where some historian maybe later or some prophet is going to come back and say, hey, wait, God's telling me that God told us this back in Moses' day, that this was wrong. Joshua tells the people and these leaders in Joshua 23, don't do it, don't lead them this way. And then they mess up in Judges, and then they're like, we want a king, and then we see some ups and downs, and then we get to David, and then we see the history, and someone surely in Babylon is sitting there and saying, wait a minute, this could have all been avoided if, like Joshua did when Moses commanded Joshua, if the leaders of Israel listened to what Joshua had to say. Be strong and courageous. Do not fear, but hold it quick to the Lord. Follow the law. But power is corrupted. It corrupted even the best leaders. And we have the stories of it. There's about one leader who was probably the least corrupt. And again, it's because he was the perfect leader. He was the perfect king. He took on our corruption so that we may not have the corruption in eternity. But that's enough about leaders, man. Especially because the more I sit there, the more we're just going to rail on politics, and we don't really need that in Bible class. Again, this idea of obedience comes out. Obedience has been in all of our stories that we've looked at this quarter. Joshua, you have to be obedient to the Lord. Week 1, be strong and courageous. I command you once again, be very strong and very courageous. Well, why? You need to be obedient because these guys will eat you alive if you're not. Beyond that, if you're an obedient leader, the people will be obedient. How many times are these poor reflections of Joshua's leadership really just the people he's supposed to lead aren't being obedient to what Joshua's commanding or has taught them? Joshua tells the people, hey, don't take anything from these cities that we are destroying, because all of it has been designated for destruction. God is going to destroy whoever has possession of this stuff, which then we could argue, okay, is it really the stuff that is in possession? Is it the ideas? What is the whole point? We're not talking about it. God has designated the ways of life, the stuff, the opulence, the way of life that says, if I have this hunk of gold, I am better than that guy. If I have this nice cloak, I'm better than him or her. Why? Because that's what the Canaanites did. And we see in Ruth, even God doesn't want that from his people. God wants his people to be selfless, of giving to those in need. He wants them to be Boaz. Boaz is meeting expectations. He's not exceeding expectations, he's meeting them. He's doing what is expected of him. And that's great. But it's also sad because it seems that he is blowing everyone out of the water on what they're supposed to do. I think of the grading on a curve phenomenon that will sometimes happen. That's because depending on who you ask, there's two different ways of thinking of it. How all the grades are supposed to be formed into a bell curve to where the average score is in the middle and you have your outliers. And then there's those who say, well, no, you draw the curve where the average is. You don't move the average to where the middle is supposed to be. And then it's a whole weird debate amongst educators because of how you want to grade, right? It's, if everyone got an 80, but I make it the average score, and so it's a bell curve. Is that how I grade? I don't know. You're explaining this to me in the middle of high school calculus for some reason because someone said something about grading on a curve. And then we got the whole discussion of, well, that's not how bell curves work, and I don't care. This is supposed to be calculus, and I'm already bored out of my mind. We haven't even gotten to the calculus part. But when there is that grading on a curve, and you get that one guy who hits the perfect score, it makes everyone else look that much worse. Because there is no moving the curve to where it helps anyone, because clearly someone didn't need help. He met expectations. He passed the test. Boaz is doing the same thing. Boaz met expectations. He passed the test. He showed that he knew that what he was taught. And everyone else clearly did not. The average is nowhere near where Boaz is. Because Boaz is obedient. And Joshua, he's telling them again, I want you to be obedient to what God has commanded us. I have led through all of these ups and downs. And the thing that got us through it wasn't because I knew the right answers, or I did know the one right answer. If we want to get to the children's class, kind of, what's the answer to everything? It's God. Well, what's the answer in this situation? I should probably ask God about it. I should probably be obedient to God about in this moment. Joshua is telling people, be obedient. Do not cling to the things that God has told you not to cling to. Specifically, I'm sure he had the tale of Achan still in his mind. You took things from the destruction of Jericho, things that were marked for destruction, that were going to lead you down a path of greed and pride, and yet you denied it, so you're adding lying to that. That's not how God wants his people to act. And so if you as leaders, you as significant individuals in the nation of Israel begin to act that way, Israel's going to be doomed. What do we see in Judges? They cling to the ways of the nations. Even at the end of Judges, when they're clamoring for a king, I guess that's not Judges, I guess that's 1 Samuel. Even in 1 Samuel, when they're saying, we want a king, we want to be like God? No. We want to be like what God wants us to be like? No. It's we want to be like the nations. We want to be like them. They have a king. They have a king that goes up to battle for them. That has to be heartbreaking for God. Because God set up Israel to where they don't need a king. You have judges, you have elders. Why? Because they will answer to the one king, God. It's kind of, I told this to a friend of mine. Because we kind of go back and forth on all these different church denominations and splits and whatever, and that we're not, neither of us are Catholic. But he did say, well, surely there has to be something right about what the Catholics are doing because they have one unified leader in the Pope. And it makes it so much easier because everyone has a marching order and they all answer to one person. And I had to sit there and think, that's just what happened in 1 Samuel. We said, we can't possibly manage our churches by ourselves. We need one person to manage all the churches. Because what would Christ be able to manage the church with if we didn't have one person for him to tell instructions to? What? You're wanting to make a king of the church. And for most of church history, the Pope was the king. His kingdom was the church. He was able to go in and tell the kings of France and Spain and England and say, hey, I want you to go do this. And they would have to answer. Because who are they going to say? Who's going to tell the king of God, basically, the king of the church, no? Very few people did and lived. Until it got reached a point where then everyone was doing it, and then everyone lived, and then we got Protestantism. But it was one of those moments of, for centuries, even Roman emperors were kind of had to give way to, well, we have to listen to this guy. He's the king who's representing God. That doesn't make sense. But not to rail on the Catholics too hard. It is history. And it goes back to this idea of obedience. God has set up Israel in a way in which they don't need a king. And yet eventually the leaders will become so corrupt that they say, we don't want more elders. We don't want more judges. We don't want more of these guys. We want a king, because that's going to fix it. That's going to fix all of our problems. Let's make a king in charge. And we saw it in the church. We don't want disorganized churches. We want someone like the apostles, but one of them, not 12 of them, one person in charge of all of the churches. Well, hey, we don't want that guy to be. So we're gonna split off. We're gonna do this, and we're gonna find our other one guy, and then we're gonna find this other one guy because we don't like him now, and whatever. And you get it. And then we have 20,000 churches in like Lubbock, Texas, and they all have more people than you would think would be in churches, and it all falls apart because they lack obedience to God. And that's not to say we should all everyone just needs to go back and we should have one big church in Lubbock and that'll just solve all of the problems. No. What will solve the problems is obedience. And if we start with obedience first, maybe some of those other problems will be resolved. Really quick, my last point. We get the promises of God. Joshua makes it very clear. There are two different types of promises God has made. He has promised to bless you, and he has promised to curse you. He's going to hit this again. That's all of chapter 24 is the same thing of he has blessed you, he is promised to curse you. And so what should we do? We should be obedient to God. And what does God want us to do? He wants us to serve him. Go out into all the nations, baptizing all men of all nations, delivering the gospel to all people. How will you serve the Lord this week? And that's my closing thought. We got a couple more minutes. I actually got us out before the bell this week. So, next week I can go over. That's right?
No.
Doesn't work that way.
It's interesting, he keeps saying the good land.
Yes.
They were given the good land, and we're given all things good,
Yes.
just like they were.
Yeah. Well, that goes even to this idea of, part of the idea is Israel's land itself is kind of designated to where it's not going to receive the cursing like other lands. You could make an argument, and I've heard it been made, that the reason why the Middle East is all desert and awful is because it's been cursed. It's land that used to be bountiful, and they have, because of the wickedness that has happened there for centuries, it has been a land that is cursed.
Did it really used to be done?
Yes. Babylon used to be is described as a beautiful city, and it had beautiful gardens.
Yeah, but that was just Babylon.
Well, sure, but it's not just the one city that was that way. It was the whole river civilization surrounding them. It was all these nations rose up, and it's described as the great cedars of Lebanon. And I don't know if it's true, but the idea of great cedars, I have to think of the redwoods in California, is great forests. And sure, yeah, they could have, it's a destructive practice, and you could argue, well, if you cut down all the trees, and then there's nothing to keep the ground there on flood season and dust storms, and then we get into the situation of well, if we're not taking care of the land, we're just going to get a dust bowl, and the dust bowl then leads to what we have in the Middle East. So you can kind of explain it away, but you can also say, no, there is something here kind of, God is not allowing them to live in a beautiful place, a prosperous land, if you're going to treat it poorly. And then you look at Israel, and it is bountiful. It has good soil. It has good land, even to this day. Even the parts that aren't under Israeli control, they're under Palestinian control, are still good land. Why? Because God has designated that land as good land and will never be cursed. Which is weird, because then we get the whole argument of, well, then who should be the ones to take it? Because then you'll get the Palestinian argument of, well, it's the Palestinian land, we need to take it. And then you get the Israeli land and say, well, it's the Israeli land, we need to take it. And then you could get the Christian argument that they made back in the 7th and 11th, 7th through 11th century, where they said, well, it's the Holy Land, it should be Christian. Well, then we're all fighting over one strip of land that's about the size of New Jersey. And that's not what God has commanded us to do. He's not asking us anymore to be good stewards of the land, specifically that land. He's asking us to go out in all to the nations and spread the good news. Proclaim the good news to all people. Baptize the believers. Where does fighting over this strip of land, the size of New Jersey, come in? You can squint your eyes and maybe you see it, but I promise you that's not what God has told us to do. And so in being obedient, that is not what we should be focusing our time and money and effort into. So now I held you over. So thank you guys.